Elias Thorne sat in a dimly lit office, his fingers tracing the blueprints of a dream that felt both agonizingly close and light years away. He wasn't just building structures. He was building a fortress against the ghosts of his past. Growing up, the word poor wasn't just a financial status for Elias. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of invisibility that he had sworn to shed, no matter the cost. Every line he drew on the tracing paper was a desperate step away from the drafty, one-room apartment of his youth, where the wind howled through the cracks like a judgmental spectator. He craved the dizzying heights of the metropolitan skyline because, from up there, he believed no one would ever be able to look down on him again. Arthur Sterling was the only man who had ever truly seen the brilliance behind Elias's hollow eyes. To the rest of the architectural world, Arthur was a titan, a living legend whose buildings possessed a rare, breathing soul. To Elias, however, Arthur was the father he never had, a mentor who treated him with a kindness that felt almost alien. Arthur believed that a building was a sacred promise made to the people who would eventually walk its halls. Integrity, he often insisted, was the invisible rebar that held a skyscraper against the gravity of time. But then came the announcement of the Solstice Tower, a multi-billion-dollar behemoth that promised to be the crown jewel of the city. It was the golden ticket Elias had been chasing his entire life, the ultimate validation of his talent. The project, however, arrived with a hidden poison. A shadowy, multi-billionaire developer whose smile was as sharp and cold as a razor presented an impossible budget for the massive structure. To make the numbers work and secure the contract, the developer demanded that structural safety regulations be bypassed. He wanted inferior steel, thinner glass, and subpar concrete, all hidden behind a facade of shimmering gold and marble. Arthur Sterling, standing tall in his unwavering ethics, flatly refused to sign off on such a lethal compromise. He chose the lives of anonymous future tenants over the prestige of the project, even if it meant losing his firm. Elias, standing in the shadow of his mentor, felt the old, familiar terror of poverty clawing at his throat. He saw the Solstice Tower not as a building, but as his final escape from the invisibility he loathed. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The choice before Elias was a jagged one. Follow his mentor into a noble, quiet obscurity, or step over Arthur's broken career into the blinding light of fame. In the quiet, hollow hours of a Tuesday night, Elias chose the light. He did the unthinkable, dismantling the man who had built him. Using his high-level access, Elias broke into Arthur's private servers and stole proprietary structural secrets that the old man had spent a lifetime perfecting. With a series of cold, calculated keystrokes, Elias planted forged emails and fabricated bank transfers, making it appear as though Arthur had been siphoning millions from the firm's accounts for years. The betrayal was surgical and absolute. Within 48 hours, the board of directors had stripped Arthur of his license and his dignity, exiling the legend from the industry he helped create. Elias Thorne was immediately named lead architect of the Solstice Tower. The world cheered for the young prodigy who had supposedly saved the project from the corruption of his predecessor. Months later, as Elias stood in his new, rain-slick penthouse overlooking the city he finally owned, the expensive champagne in his hand tasted like ash. A courier arrived with a single, handwritten envelope from Arthur. There were no threats or insults inside, just a single sentence scrawled in a shaky, familiar hand. "A house built on sand cannot hold the weight of a guilty man." Elias looked out at the city lights, the words chilling his bones more than the winter wind ever could. 5 years flowed by, like a river of molten gold, hardening into a life that most men would kill to possess. Elias Thorne was no longer the hungry architect haunted by the spectre of poverty. He was a titan, a household name whose signature on a blueprint could shift the stock market. He moved through the world with the studied grace of a man who owned the air he breathed. His garage was a gallery of precision engineering, and his home was a fortress of glass that looked out over the city he had reshaped. To the public, he was the ultimate success story, a genius who had conquered the skyline. But behind the heavy oak doors of his study, the mask was becoming heavy, its sharp edges cutting into his skin. The wealth that was supposed to bring peace had instead brought a corrosive brand of paranoia. Elias existed in a state of perpetual vigilance, his mind a battlefield where he fought ghosts that refused to stay buried. He had become a master of the sideways glance, searching for the same hunger in his subordinates that had once driven him to destroy Arthur Sterling. Every talented young designer in his firm was a potential usurper, a mirror of his younger, more ruthless self. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The darkness of the night was too full of Arthur's voice, echoing that final, devastating letter. He spent his nights wandering his cavernous halls, his footsteps sounding like a ticking clock. The distance between Elias and his family had grown from a crack into a canyon. His wife, Sarah, lived in the quiet desperation of a woman married to a monument rather than a man. She saw the hollow space where his soul used to be, the way his eyes never truly focused on her or their children. He was a provider of things, tuition for elite schools and diamond necklaces, but he was a stranger to their hearts. His children viewed him with a mixture of awe and resentment, a legendary figure who appeared in magazines but vanished when a nightmare needed soothing. He was a ghost in a $1,000 suit who had traded intimacy for the cold comfort of prestige. The cycle of corruption tightened its grip when the billionaire developer returned, demanding a project that pushed the boundaries of safety even further than before. The developer did not ask. He reminded Elias of their shared history, a silent blackmail that hung in the air like smoke. Elias saw the flaws in the new designs, the way the physics did not hold up under the pressure of the reduced budget, but he felt powerless to refuse the man who held the keys to his past. He was a prisoner of his own success, bound to a partner who knew exactly where the secrets were buried. To maintain his greatness, Elias kept building on a crumbling foundation. Cracks were no longer just metaphors. They were becoming physical realities. Reports began to trickle in from the Solstice Tower, small things at first. A jammed door on the 50th floor, a hairline fracture in a support pillar, and a strange metallic moaning that echoed through the vents during storms. The temporary shortcuts he had authorized years ago were reaching their expiration date. Elias did not fix the problems. He buried them deeper. He used his wealth to buy the silence of inspectors and launched aggressive legal campaigns against anyone who dared to question the tower's integrity. He was trying to stop a flood with a handful of sand, his desperation growing with every new bribe he signed. The final thread of his personal life snapped on his daughter's graduation day. He missed the ceremony. Stuck in a room with lawyers, fighting to suppress a whistleblower's report that threatened to expose his use of substandard materials. When he finally returned home, the celebratory dinner sat cold on the table, and the look in his daughter's eyes told him that he had lost something far more valuable than a contract. He knew the price of everything, but the value of nothing. That night, as he stood alone in his dark office, a sudden, violent tremor shook the floor. He looked out at the skyline, his heart hammering against his ribs. Across the city, the Solstice Tower groaned, a guttural sound of steel crying out in agony. The weight of his guilt was finally becoming too much for the earth to hold. The groaning of the Solstice Tower was a sound that would haunt the city's collective memory for a generation. It was a slow, agonizing surrender of steel that had been forced to carry more than it was designed to bear. By dawn, the area was a sprawling zone of flashing lights and sirens. Residents were herded into the cold air, their lives upended, because Elias Thorne had decided a promotion was worth a few thinner support beams. Forensic engineers moved through the hollowed-out skeleton of his masterpiece, uncovering the brittle steel and porous concrete he had signed off on. The billionaire developer vanished into a labyrinth of shell companies, leaving Elias to stand alone in the wreckage. His firm, once a crown jewel, dissolved into endless lawsuits. Driven by a hollow ache, Elias found himself standing before a modest cottage on the quiet edge of the state. Arthur Sterling was there, his back curved by time, tending to a small patch of wildflowers. The old man looked fragile, but his eyes held a clarity that made Elias feel naked. Elias had arrived with a rehearsed speech of excuses, but the words withered in Arthur's calm. There was no anger in the mentor's eyes, only a profound, quiet pity. He told Elias that the tragedy wasn't the tower's failure. The tragedy had happened the moment Elias decided that being seen was more important than being sound. Arthur whispered that a man who builds a palace on a lie eventually finds himself a prisoner in its basement. Elias realized then that he hadn't lost his career today. He had lost his humanity years ago in that rain-slicked penthouse. The return to the city was a descent into a cold reality. The penthouse, once his fortress, now felt like a mausoleum. Sarah was gone, unable to look at the stranger who had replaced her husband. She took the children and left a note that didn't mention money, only the hope that they might one day remember a version of him that didn't crave the world's applause. With his assets seized and his name a curse, Elias reached a point of absolute stillness. The mask had finally shattered. Instead of fleeing to a country without an extradition treaty, he walked into the federal prosecutor's office. He turned over the evidence against the developer. He gave them everything, finally choosing the truth over his own skin. The years in prison were a slow reconstruction of a broken man. In the grey silence of the facility, Elias found a purpose that wealth could never provide. He began to teach. In a cramped, poorly lit classroom, he sat with men who had also tried to take shortcuts through life. He taught them the mathematics of structural integrity, the sacred responsibility of building something meant to last. He wasn't teaching them how to build icons of vanity. He was teaching them how to build with a conscience. He realized that a single, honest design for a small shed was more significant than a 1,000-foot tower built on a foundation of deceit. When the day of his release finally came, Elias emerged into a world that had moved on. He was older, and his pockets were empty once again. He traveled to a small community park, a project he had designed during his sentence. He sat on a simple wooden bench, watching a young father help his daughter navigate a climbing frame. The children's laughter was a sound more precious than any award he had ever won. The beams were true. He was anonymous, but as the sun set, he felt a peace. In a small puddle, he saw a man who no longer needed a mask. Success, he finally understood, was not what you possessed, but who you were when everything else was stripped away. For the first time in decades, Elias Thorne was truly home, anchored by a truth that no storm could ever shake.